In view of the extreme heat, I would like to invite you to sit for the invocation. Invocare, in Latin, to call upon, on this special afternoon of beginnings and joy. As you are willing, let us call together on the presence of the God of dappled things, divine comfort, divine wisdom. Let us call together on the divine who emerges in classroom and in community, in text and object, beautiful and terrifying. Let us call together on the divine who, maybe with a strange sense of humor, calls out of a burning bush, before whom sometimes we must take off our shoes and hide our faces and remember the limits of knowledge. On this special afternoon, to mark new beginnings of our studies and our work together, as you're willing, let us call together on the presence of those in past and in present who sustain us and bring us to this place, those whose memory or presence helps us to ask how our work honors them and moves towards justice. The grandfather in the steel mill, the father seeing patience, the grandmother in time of war making clothes out of flour bags, the mother in the pulpit, the teachers who drove through us a green fuse to blossom in our minds, the communities that thought enough of us to encourage us to come here. We are called together today at Harvard because we felt a call or because we seek a call. In the bright days of fall and cooler days of winter, when we're overwhelmed by the burning bush in which we discover God or others' ideas of God, when we reach out to touch the holy and it hurts, when our study of scripture and religious practice make no sense, when we have defamiliarized to the point of loneliness and loss and wonder. At those times, as you're able and when you need, call upon the divine and the human that brought you here and whose depths you wish to plumb. The great cloud of witnesses that reminds you what love or trouble or joy set before you led you on your path to Harvard, that reminds you of what you are called to do and for whom you are called to do it. And may God help us, and may we help each other towards that call. Amen.
It's my particular pleasure to welcome everyone here to this new beginning. My faculty and staff colleagues, students, new and returning, and all guests who may be here. This is the 95th instance of a new academic year starting at Harvard Divinity School. 195th, I should have said. 195th instance. Goes back a little farther than that. And also, it's good to be able to welcome you to this official opening of the 2010-11 school year. For the first time in recent history, we are celebrating Convocation here on the new campus green at HDS, which is about to enter its second year. And it's a great pleasure to be able to do that even in the heat, perhaps even because of the heat. Those of you know that most of our auditoriums at Harvard are not air-conditioned, so we're probably better here in the open. It is tomorrow that we really begin in earnest, our first day of fall term classes, and our incoming students, as well as our new staff and faculty members, have been oriented, informed, and prepared these past few weeks and just these past few days for most of the students to start a new chapter in all of our lives in this institution. It's my pleasure in particular on this occasion to welcome most cordially Peter Machinist, Hancock Professor of Hebrew and other Oriental languages, my departmental colleague in Near Eastern languages and civilizations, as well as in the Divinity School. And in a few minutes, Professor Machinist will be presenting this year's Convocation Address entitled An 11th Commandment, Thou Shalt Defamiliarize. Incoming faculty members will be introduced more extensively at our first faculty meeting on Monday, September 13th, but on this occasion I would like to mention them here and ask them to stand when I read their name and title, and to please remain standing until all 7 are recognized, at which point I hope all of you here will join me in welcoming applause. We're delighted to welcome 2 brand new faculty members to our full-time ranks. First, Mayra Rivera. Mayra, if you would stand. Jonathan L. Walton, Assistant Professor of African American Religions, minor as Assistant Professor of Theology and Latina Studies. Jonathan, there you are. Welcome. We're further pleased to welcome 5 new visiting scholars to our Women's Studies in Religion program for the coming year. Hawa Ibrahim, visiting lecturer on Women's Studies and Islamic Law. Hawa, welcome. And also our Colorado scholar this year in the Women's Studies in Religion program. Bethany Moriton, visiting Assistant Professor of Women's Studies and History of Christianity. Bethany, welcome. Zhangge Ni, visiting Assistant Professor of Women's Studies and Chinese Religion and Literature. It's a pleasure to have you. Yüksel Sezgin, visiting Assistant Professor of Women's Studies and Religion and the Social Sciences. Yüksel, welcome. Pamela Verkel, visiting Assistant Professor of Women's Studies and History of Christianity. Pamela, it's good to have you. So let's give them all a round of applause. I would now like to invite Professor Francis Schussler-Fiorenza to the lectern to present the first reading for the day, taken from the book of Exodus. He will be followed directly, without further introduction, by doctoral candidate John B. Whitley, who will read from 2 Samuel. A musical meditation will follow each of the 2 readings. Let us enjoy these. Francis?
Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." And then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baale-Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went out in front of it. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with song and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark of God. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah, so that the place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" So David was unwilling to take the ark of the Lord into his care in the city of David. Instead, David took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his household.
It's my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Peter Machinist, who came to us here at Harvard from a position at the University of Michigan in 1991. Here, as I mentioned earlier, he has served both in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and in the Divinity School. Earlier, he taught in departments of religion or Near Eastern Studies at Case Western Reserve University and the University of Arizona before his time at the University of Michigan. He has also been a visiting lecturer and Lady Davis visiting professor in Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The University of Zurich awarded him an honorary doctorate in 2009. His primary scholarly interest is in the cultural, intellectual, and social history of the ancient Near East, focusing particularly on ancient Israel, the Hebrew Bible, and ancient Mesopotamia. His research and teaching topics have included the etiology of imperialism, ancient historiography, mythology, prophecy, Assyrian history, and the history of modern biblical and Near Eastern scholarship. He has authored a wide range of publications in these fields, and among his current projects is a volume of commentary on the prophetic book of Nahum. What is most important, however, for me to say about Peter as friend and colleague is that he is the kind of colleague, mentor, and teacher that everyone longs to have in the academy. An exemplary scholar, he is known to his colleagues as a genial, supportive, widely read, and wise interlocutor and counselor. His students know him as a caring mentor and the most modest of polymaths. We are privileged to count him among our scholarly associates here at Harvard, and I count it a particular privilege to have him as a longtime colleague and to be able to introduce him to you today. Today, he will expand upon the 10 Commandments, a small task for someone of his accomplishment, and add an 11th, it would seem. Please welcome him down from his mountain with whatever tablets he may be bringing. Peter, please.
After an introduction like that, I think I'd better really go home. Thank you so much, Bill. I would like to begin with a story. It took place long, long ago, though not in a place far, far away. In fact, it was in Boston, but the time was the spring of 1964 when I was a sophomore in the college of this university. For 2 weeks at the end of March, the beginning of April of that year, a new production of Shakespeare's Hamlet was on a trial run at the Shubert Theater prior to its New York showing. The play was directed by one of the greatest of British actors, Sir John Gielgud, and the cast included some real all-stars, but none more than the one who played Hamlet. It was Richard Burton, certainly one of Gielgud's successors, and then famous not only or as much for his thespian talents as for the torrid love affair he had been pursuing with one of the sirens of the Hollywood silver screen, Elizabeth Taylor. Their affair was the focus of all the media, and the buzz, indeed at times the pandemonium surrounding it, had only been heightened by the fact that during the first performances of this Hamlet in Toronto prior to Boston, Burton and Taylor had gotten married. My mother took my sister and me to the Shubert for a matinee, as I recall, and it was indeed magical. Burton in particular had a kind of music in his voice, like his Welsh compatriot Dylan Thomas, a feeling for the rhythm and melody of the bard's verse that I had never heard before, though one of the Boston critics, unaccountably to me it appears, reproached him for having a voice that is not musical. But it was not only the performance that was for me riveting, it was also an interview that Richard Burton gave while in Boston to arguably the leading media drama critic of the city, Elliot Norton, on his weekly television show about the arts. Norton, by the way, was the one who had called Burton's voice unmusical. Norton asked Burton several questions about how he was playing Hamlet, and one of these struck me with particular force. I noticed in watching your play, I'm paraphrasing Norton here because I can't remember the exact words and I don't have access to any transcript or tape. I noticed in watching your play that when you came to the famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question, in Act 3, Scene 1, you spoke it very fast, and it took me a few moments to realize that it was in fact this soliloquy that you were speaking. Did you do this deliberately? And if so, why? Burton answered directly, even forcefully, and again I have to paraphrase, perhaps even embroider a little. Yes, it was deliberate, and the reason was the nature of this soliloquy. It is one of the most well-known speeches in the English or any language, something every child in an English-speaking land reads and perhaps learns in school. How then to get an audience to forget it as the monumental, solitary crag that they had grown up with and hear it afresh, as part of the larger play of Hamlet, as an important moment in the play's dramatic trajectory? I thought, continued Burton, that by moving into it very rapidly, I would prevent the audience from detaching the speech from what had come before it in the play and compel them to hear the speech as a piece of the play's development. And so Richard Burton did, at least for me, and apparently even for his television interlocutor, Elliot Norton. What had I experienced in Burton's work as Hamlet? As I began to think about it in the years afterward, I came to see with increased clarity that Burton's was a considered and determined effort to jolt me out of what I had been, or thought I had been, used to shake up for me an old icon of a speech, become rather musty in my conception, and make me hear it as something live and breathing as I'd not heard or read it before. To put it another way, Burton was out to take away the familiar and make the speech fresh in its unfamiliarity, to defamiliarize the speech. Of course, what Richard Burton did that day reaches well beyond Hamlet. It reverberates in many other arenas. More particularly, as I worked my way into the field of biblical studies, I found myself coming back again and again to the issue of what came to be called, after the Russian formalist critics of the early 20th century, defamiliarization. The term is now everywhere, so much so that it perhaps needs some defamiliarization. If it has become particularly visible in the biblical field, that is because it addresses so centrally the interpretive challenge that the Bible poses. How, in short, do you take an ancient text like the Hebrew Bible, produced in a culture very removed in time and space, and often in perspective and worldview from our own here in a 20th century, then 21st century Western society, and make that text speak? How do you do so, even more when that text is not, at least for the most part, one that has just been dug up, where it has lain cocooned in all its ancientness for centuries, even millennia, but rather one that has lived down through these centuries or millennia as a text of force and authority, and so come to us now laden with the wares of its journey. To be sure, there is for the Bible, as for many other kinds of texts, the distinct possibility that its original pristine form may not be recoverable. And even if that form were recoverable, many would, I think, now agree that no single definitive meaning would emerge, if only because there may well not have been one. But that does not mean that the biblical text is just like something written today, unless that's something being an imitation of the Bible itself. There's indeed something strange, something different about it, even if the centuries of rereading it have changed and in various instances smoothed over that strangeness. How then to read, to hear the biblical text in its strangeness and yet make that strangeness newly familiar? This is my task briefly to sketch out this afternoon, and I'd like to do so through two biblical texts that comprise the readings for our convocation that you've just heard. Exodus 3, verses 1 to 6, part of the encounter of Moses with God at the burning bush, and 2 Samuel 6, verses 1 to 11, the procession of the Ark of the Covenant to King David's new capital in Jerusalem. Exodus 3 at the burning bush is on its surface a fairly simple, straightforward narrative. Moses, a renegade escapee from Pharaonic Egypt to the Sinai wilderness, encounters a bush there that burns without being burned up. This phenomenon, in turn, is the setting for another. For out of the bush, we are told, comes the angel or messenger of God watching Moses, and then the voice of God himself addressing him. I won't get into the issue of angel and God being part of the same. They are. God tells Moses to take off his shoes, as you've heard, because the bush and the area around it are holy ground. God then identifies himself, and in the verses that follow verse 6, he affirms that he will take his suffering people out of Egypt, using Moses to lead them out. As I said, this is on the surface a straightforward narrative, but behind it lie several puzzles, perhaps foremost of which is, how can bushes burn without being burnt? And then talk, and who is talking and how? I suspect that many of us these days reading such a text and in this Western world don't think too much about questions like these. We say that's the way they thought and wrote in those biblical days, that the divine could invade and pervade anything and everyone. But if it ever happened then for most of us, not all to be very sure, it doesn't happen now. Or we assert it never really happened as described in the first place. Rather, the Bible has distorted in its primitive, rationally unsophisticated fashion what was really going on. The pre-modern commentators on the Bible in Jewish and Christian circles were exercised at points about what was happening here. God somehow was in the picture, but how did Moses apprehend him? How could he see and talk with them? Bachya ben Asher, a 14th century Spanish Jewish commentator, tried to argue that this Exodus text presents Moses as apprehending God in a set of 3 stages, each spiritually higher than the preceding, namely through the fire, through the angel, and finally God's presence, or what in Rabbinic Hebrew is called the Shekhinah. But Bachya still supposed that what was at stake was some kind of real colloquy between 2 personalities, Moses and the deity. We have to wait, it seems, until the 20th century, although I'm sure there's a precedent here that I've overlooked. But at least until the 20th century before we find another solution to this issue. And one place we can find it is in Cecil B. DeMille's remaking of his cinematic extravaganza, The 10 Commandments, 1956. Text I often use in class, but have to use less frequently now as the knowledge of it and its impact fades into the long, distant past. If you listen very carefully to the scene at the burning bush between Charlton Heston, alias Moses, and God, alias That's the Question, if you listen very carefully, I think you will find that the voice coming out of the bush is Charlton Heston's, but lowered, transformed, distorted. I used to say this periodically in class, and on one occasion, the head teaching fellow of the class, Susie Park, came to me afterwards and said, "There's a student who's afraid to tell you that you're wrong, but you're wrong." Why? Because he grew up in a town where there was an old man who said he was the voice in the bush. I was crestfallen. One of my magic moments in teaching had disappeared. And then I found a note that said there were many retakes of this scene with apparently a number of different options. And at the end, only Cecil B. DeMille and his sound engineer know what version was taken, and they're both dead. However, there seems to be a kind of consensus now that really in the version that is shown publicly, whether on television before Easter and Passover or in a DVD, is indeed Heston's. Think about that for a moment. This is 1956. How do you deal with revelation? How do you deal with conversations, with close encounters of the fourth kind, as Truffaut would have said? Well, there was a movement, as a number of you know far better than I, in the middle decades of the 20th century, particularly in North America, that prayer, of course, is not really a communion with an outside force. It's a communion with yourself. It's a reaching deep inside your conscience to find what really is involved in a particular issue that may be confronting you. And I suspect that consciously or unconsciously, this is what lies behind DeMille's use of Heston's voice, although some have noted that in another point of the film, when God thunders from Sinai itself, it's a different voice. Okay, we'll give him the fact that from Sinai it has to be different. But when Moses is really talking to himself, that's what he's really doing, said DeMille. Is that what the biblical text says? Well, we'll never really know what the authors say, but if we read this text closely, and we heard it in what Professor Fiorenza gave to us a few moments ago, you will see that on the one hand, there's no mistaking that the biblical narrator thinks that there are 2 separate voices here, God's and Moses's. He also, at the same time, marks this colloquy as something very special, a bush that it burns and doesn't get burnt up, a voice that comes out of a bush. Clearly, these are meant to be markers that for the biblical author and the audience to whom he was orienting himself, found this a very special kind of occurrence. What is the defamiliarization here? I suspect it's first to start with something like what a DeMille would have offered us. That prayer maybe is not simply a communing with your own conscience, but it is a way to get in touch with something beyond, whatever that beyond may be. At least I think it would only be fair to hand it to these biblical authors that they believe that and they weren't trying to trick themselves or us. Defamiliarization then in this particular instance might be, in the first instance, strangely, to read the text as it just appears. Let me look at the second example. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 1 to 11, traveling with the Ark of the Covenant on its way to Jerusalem. The setting of this episode is well known. David, now become king of all the tribes of Israel and Judah, conquers the city of Jerusalem and makes it his own capital, his own city of David. To solidify his conquest and his new status as king of all Israel, he needs to make Jerusalem not only his political, but his religious capital, what anthropologists these days might call a regal ritual center. Isn't that nice? Not biblical, but okay. New kind of biblical. The key to the installation of this city as a religious as well as political capital is the installation in turn of the most sacred, the holiest object in Israel, the Ark of the Covenant, currently in a temporary shelter outside of Jerusalem. The texts here vary a little bit about where. Now comes our episode. In it, a man named Uzzah, son of Aminadab, the father at whose house or estate the ark in the previous verses was said to be in temporary residence, this Uzzah is assigned with his brother to bring the ark to Jerusalem. The ark is put into a newly built wagon for the journey, Uzzah tending to the oxen and the wagon that draw it, the oxen that draw the wagon, and his brother stationed to walk in front of them all. And then the disaster occurs. As the brothers lead the wagon toward Jerusalem, the oxen suddenly, and the verb here is difficult to translate. Historically, in the English tradition, the word has been translated stumble. The translation that was used today said something about letting the ark go, which may be the case, shamtu in Hebrew. In any case, it looks as if the wagon is about to overturn and spill the ark out, and Uzzah, right next to the oxen and the wagon, as you will recall, springs immediately into action, puts his hand out and takes hold of the ark, grasps it, v'yochezbo in Hebrew, to prevent this ark from spilling out and getting damaged. At that very moment of touching the ark, however, Uzzah is struck dead. Or as the biblical text puts it, God became very angry with Uzzah and struck him there on the threshold, well, maybe the threshold. This is a problem. And he died, but he struck him in any case. We'll come back to this curious phrase in a moment. And he died there beside the ark of God. What happened? The passage does not make it clear. It gives no apparent reason other than this phrase that I very temporally and incorrectly translated as threshold. The passage gives no apparent reason for God's anger and for his striking Uzzah. The next verse, in fact, registers the anger of David against God, as we've heard, using the very same locution as that which described God's anger against Uzzah. David is angry with God for breaking out against Uzzah. Clearly, David found God's action against Uzzah unwarranted, even unjust, though these terms are not used, and the reason for David's anger also is not precisely specified. We have to go to another text in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 13, which adds, God struck out against Uzzah because Uzzah put forth his hand against the ark. Okay, but that still doesn't tell us what was wrong about putting forth your hand to save the ark. The point is that in the biblical text, either in 2 Samuel or in the book of Chronicles, we'll leave out the ancient versions for a moment, No apparent reason is given for what God does to Uzzah. So the question remains, how could this disaster have happened? Why? The disaster is regarded as sufficiently momentous that the ark does not then continue on into Jerusalem, but on David's orders is parked, as it were, in another temporary resting place, namely the house of another individual, Obed-Edom. And it remains there for a kind of cooling off period of 3 months, when, as we heard, at the end God blesses the house of this Obed-Edom. And then the next verse, which we didn't hear, says that David then takes the ark successfully on into Jerusalem. So we still have the question, what happened? And why did poor Uzzah get shafted or zapped? In trying to answer this question, already the ancients, and there's perhaps a hint of this, maybe even in the first book of Chronicles 13, they try to supply a reason, to look for a sin, something done wrong that Uzzah had committed in handling the ark, for which God then punished him. Here, this phrase that I had first translated on the threshold is taken as the key phrase. The ancient Aramaic translation, the Targum, translates it as in error, and this is picked up by several medieval commentators, although the error is not specified always. A church father of the 5th century, Salvian the presbyter from Marseille, argues that Uzzah was, quote, undutiful in his very act of steadying the tottering ark because he went beyond his orders, although he doesn't specify what orders were given to him, other than perhaps maybe not to touch the ark. On the medieval side, in rabbinic terms, David Kimchi, a major commentator of the medieval period, takes up this phrase that the Targum had translated in error and talks about it as the fact that Uzzah touched the ark when it should have been only the Levites, of whom Uzzah was not a member. Later on, his family are made honorary members by the chronicler, but that's something else. Uzzah touched the ark when only a certain class of people in Israel, the Levites, could do so. So what then finally are we dealing with in this ark and the wagon? It's always for me remained a kind of touchstone of suddenly hitting a brick wall. Let's start by taking the story at face value. The story in 2 Samuel 6, namely that Uzzah, well-intentioned and certainly not a deliberate sinner, ventures into territory that is dangerous. The space, the world of the Ark of the Covenant. The issue then is not an ethical one. It's not one of right versus wrong, of being evil or being good. It is rather one of the danger of the sacred world, represented by the ark over against the profane world of humans. This has, to be sure, been recognized by some modern commentators, among them our colleague Kyle McCarter of Johns Hopkins University. And it reminds me, as it probably reminds a number of you, most powerfully of one of the most important books in religious phenomenology that appeared in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, Rudolf Otto's Das Heilige, translated the idea of the holy, who famously talked about the divine, if you remember, as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, that force which cannot be comprehended in any human rational form, which is overpowering and yet ineluctably draws the individual toward its center. Maybe I can use a more pedestrian analogy, which I've tried in class on a couple of occasions, namely that of a live high-voltage electric fence. If you see a little child next to that fence and you lunge toward the child to try to save it, and you touch that fence with, let's say, 100,000 volts, and you don't have insulation on, too bad, you're gone. You can have the best intentions in the world, but you're not properly protected to deal with the electrical force of the fence. In this way, presumably, Uzzah was not properly protected. He was not ready. He did what anybody in his proper right mind would have done on the moment to try to save the ark, and yet he was killed because he wasn't ready for it. This understanding of the ark story with Uzzah, it seems to me, must begin then by recognizing its strangeness to us. And I would remind you that the Russian formalists, when they coined the word shklovsky, defamiliarization, used the word which in Russian means to make strange, recognizing its strangeness to us in a contemporary Western 21st century society. Strangeness of a deity that lashes out murderously against a man only with the purest of intentions toward that deity's most potent manifestation, the Ark of the Covenant. It is this strangeness to us that paradoxically serves as both a barrier and a bridge to understanding what is going on here, and how then subsequent interpreters, starting already in antiquity, tried to make sense of it. And in recognizing this strangeness, we are brought into the territory of defamiliarization. Let's review where we've come. We started with Richard Burton, fresh from the excess of Elizabeth Taylor. And here I would argue that to defamiliarize is, in the first instance, to take us out of what was expected, what we would have expected in listening to this famous soliloquy, to be or to not to be, to put us into a different perspective, to let us think about that perspective as at least a legitimate possibility for grasping what this speech was about. When we looked at Exodus chapter 3 and the burning bush, what we had to defamiliarize in some way, I think, was the effort to familiarize the text at the hands of people like Cecil B. DeMille and his writers. When we get to finally 2 Samuel 6 and the story of the Ark of the Covenant, we start here, I think, with something that hits us as a broadside, as something utterly strange, a story that presents an apparent disconnection between the action of Uzzah and the consequence of that action, namely his immediate death at the hands of God. And in that disconnection lies the beginning of a new way of thinking about a connection between them. My interpretations of these three texts and performances, Hamlet, Burton, Burning Bush, and Traveling Ark, of course are not and cannot be definitive, and the multivalent history of the interpretation of the Bible only underscores this point. Yet if interpretation remains a continuous and infinite process, what I've tried to suggest is that it plays constantly with the problem of finding the right, or better, finding the most productive distance on the part of us as interpreters from the text or issue or phenomenon we are trying to interpret. Neither too close so that we are swallowed up by it, that we can't really interpret. We can't really translate it into idioms that we can grasp, and yet not so far away that all we can hear of this phenomenon or text is our own breathing. This finding the right distance is really, I think, what is involved in the twin modes of what now should be apparent as both defamiliarization and familiarization, of recognizing the strangeness in what we are interpreting, and of learning to caress and explore it so that paradoxically it remains strange in its new familiarity. What I've been describing I regard as central to the teaching and learning challenge before us all, and with us at this school. It is also central to us as we stop to think about it, as we make our own way through our life's journeys. It's why I've called the need to defamiliarize an 11th Commandment for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Machinist. A benediction, as you know, means good words, and it's always best if those words are few, even in more temperate weather than this. The writer Gernilla Norris has a few good words for an occasion like this, as we're gathered here in unimaginable privilege, poised on the edge of an exciting new academic year, in a world ravaged by unimaginable need. This is how we will know we are no longer hungry, she writes. That the world is as full of terror as it is of beauty, And yet, we are not afraid to find solace here, to be bread for each other, to love. The year to come will bring us all inestimable wonders, mystery, and beauty, as surely as it will bring its own new tide of terrors in this broken, magnificent world. So before the next tide rises tomorrow, let's just pause for a moment in silence to remember why we're in this place, what it is that washed each of us up here, and what it is that will soon enough pull us back out. And in that silence, let's offer thanksgiving for the unimaginable privilege of being together for a while here, being together. And let's seek courage in that silence for the immense responsibilities that that privilege confers. May we not be afraid to find solace here in our teaching and our learning, our questioning and our debating, our writing and our reading, in our classrooms and our libraries, in this city, and in all the places this year will take us. May we not be afraid to find solace here, to be bread for one another, to love. May it be so. Amen. And friends, we go forth into this new year singing, and maybe even in harmony. How about that? What would it be like to keep the harmony going all year? Let's see if we can do that. As you are willing and able, and if you are still hydrated enough to do so, we invite you to stand and join together in song.
At the end of this celebratory occasion, I want to thank our speaker and everyone who's participated in the program or contributed their work, effort, and time to making this event such a successful one. Many thanks particularly to Harry Huff, our music director, to the Riverside Brass Quartet, and to our two solo musicians, Alex Ramos and Jack Davidson. You are now officially dismissed and may move to the Rockefeller Refectory, where I understand there is food and drink, and I think even air conditioning. So you are dismissed.